There is a room, a table, two chairs, and a decision. Someone has to walk in, sit down across from a person who has killed other human beings, and ask them to tell the truth. Not a detective, not a prosecutor, a psychiatrist, a scientist whose job is not to condemn, but to understand. Dr. Helen Morrison made that decision 37 times in the first year alone. She would eventually conduct more face-to-face psychiatric interviews with convicted serial killers than any researcher in documented history. 135, across 4 decades, including John Wayne Gacy, the man who murdered 33 people, buried beneath his house, photographed alongside the First Lady, described by neighbors as the kindest man they had ever met. Subscribe to CurioMind. By the end of this video, you will understand the conclusion that 40 years of these conversations produced, and why that conclusion is not about them, it is about us. Helen Morrison received her medical degree from the University of Illinois and her psychiatric training from the University of Chicago. She entered forensic psychiatry in the early 1970s, when the field had almost no structured framework for understanding individuals who committed multiple murders. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had only just been founded in 1972, and its early interview protocols were being improvised. Morrison's question was different. She was not building a criminal profile, she was asking a clinical question. What psychologically is actually happening inside a person who kills repeatedly? The academic establishment had answers ready. These individuals were psychotic, delusional, or simply evil. Morrison rejected both explanations on clinical grounds. Psychosis was documentable. Evil was not. Neither matched what she was seeing in the interviews. What she encountered was something the clinical literature had no adequate language for yet. In 1978, John Wayne Gacy was arrested. Morrison entered Cook County Jail in early 1979 to interview him, as the full scale of what had been discovered beneath his house was still being processed. She expected, based on everything the clinical literature said, to encounter either extreme psychopathology, clear breaks from reality, or calculated strategic evasion. She encountered neither. Gacy presented as a perfectly coherent, socially functional adult. He was articulate. He made eye contact. He discussed the legal proceedings rationally. What he did not do, across 20 years of subsequent interviews, was display genuine psychological distress about the deaths of 33 people. Not suppressed grief. Not managed guilt. Morrison's clinical observation was more disturbing. He did not appear to register the deaths as experiences that had any psychological reality to him. They were events that had occurred, like weather. Over the following years, Morrison continued interviewing Gacy and began conducting interviews with other convicted serial killers: Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper, Richard Ramirez, Henry Lee Lucas. Each case she approached with the same clinical framework: standard psychiatric evaluation, supplemented by her own protocol designed to assess identity structure. What she found, across case after case, was the same absence. Not psychosis, not a broken self, an absent one. The term she arrived at, published in her 2004 book, was identity failure. In the clinical developmental psychological sense, the self that typically forms during adolescence, through what Erikson described as the identity crisis, had not consolidated. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to build a house, but the foundation was never poured. You can paint the walls, install windows, but there's nothing holding it together. What remained was functional behavior organized around external signals and social scripts. A human being capable of mimicking the appearance of a full person without possessing the internal psychological architecture of one. Erikson's theory identified identity formation as the critical psychological task of adolescence, between ages 12 and 18. During this period, the developing individual integrates experiences, attachments, and self-perceptions into a coherent, continuous sense of self. According to Morrison, what the individuals she interviewed shared was a documented failure of this developmental process. traceable to specific periods of disrupted early development. A 2017 study tracking over 1,200 participants found that disruptions in early caregiver attachment were strongly associated with identity diffusion in late adolescence, an inability to consolidate stable self-concept across contexts. The subjects in Morrison's interview sample had, without exception, profiles consistent with severe early attachment disruption, Gacy's abusive father, Bundy's unknown biological parentage, Dahmer's unstable home environment. The disruption preceded the violence by decades. Morrison's behavioral findings gained support from neuroimaging research. A 2013 study examining fMRI data from serial homicide offenders found significant structural differences in the anterior insula, a brain region associated with empathy and self-awareness. Reduced gray matter volume in this region correlated with lower empathy scores and higher psychopathy scores. The neurological evidence pointed toward the same absence Morrison had documented clinically. Not broken empathy, but absent integration. A 2018 study found that this volume reduction predicted what researchers described as reduced somatic marker functioning. Here's what that means. Your brain normally has a gut feeling system, learned emotional responses that guide your decisions. When that system is structurally absent, the individual experiences the world as external events to be managed, not as a moral landscape to be navigated. Morrison's clinical language had arrived decades earlier at the same place. Morrison interviewed Ted Bundy. Her clinical assessment diverged from the dominant forensic narrative, which characterized Bundy as a psychopath, a person who understood right from wrong and chose wrong. What Morrison documented was something more structurally precise. Bundy possessed sophisticated behavioral mimicry, the ability to produce, on demand, the external markers of emotional response, without the internal framework that generates those responses authentically. He could narrate his childhood. He could identify emotions in others. He could use emotional vocabulary with technical accuracy. What he could not do was experience the integration of self across time that makes moral decision-making possible. A person who chooses evil is making a moral decision within a functioning moral framework. A person who lacks the underlying psychological infrastructure is not making a choice in that sense. According to Morrison's framework, Bundy's behavior was not chosen in any morally meaningful sense. It was the output of a system that had no functional access to the consequences it was generating for others. This is why, she argued, rehabilitation is not a meaningful category for this population. You cannot rehabilitate a structure that was never built. Jeffrey Dahmer presented a different clinical picture, but arrived at the same fundamental conclusion. Where Bundy had sophisticated social functioning, Dahmer had significantly impaired social performance. The isolation, the social failure, the evident dysfunction were visible. What united them in Morrison's framework was not the surface presentation, but the underlying structural deficit, an absence of integrated self capable of registering other human beings as possessing interior experiences. Dahmer's behavior was interpreted by Morrison as evidence of a fundamental inability to differentiate self from other at the identity level. He did not experience other people, clinically, as separate beings. He experienced them as extensions of his own psychological field. A 1994 forensic analysis corroborated the developmental timeline. The behavioral patterns were documentable as far back as age 8. The violence was not the beginning of the pathology. It was its expression decades later. Across 135 interviews, Morrison documented a single structural consistency: the absence of what developmental psychologists call object permanence at the human level. Not the infant milestone, understanding that objects exist when not in view. The adult level extension, the understanding experienced emotionally and not merely intellectually, that other human beings have interior lives, continuous self-experiences that persist independently of one's own perception. Every clinical subject in Morrison's sample had never acquired this capacity at the functional level, not as a belief they rejected, not as a moral position they held. As a developmental structure they had never built. The implication is significant on two levels. First, The traditional forensic psychology framework, which positions serial homicide as a choice, is clinically insufficient. The population Morrison documented did not reject moral reality. They had no functional access to it. Second, and more disturbing, the behavioral signals we typically rely on to detect dangerous individuals, observable remorse, visible distress, are specifically absent in precisely this population. The individuals who are most dangerous are, by Morrison's definition, the ones least likely to display the signals we are neurologically primed to look for. Helen Morrison saw John Wayne Gacy for the last time in 1994, 2 weeks before his execution. He told her he was innocent. She didn't argue, because the self capable of accepting that guilt had never existed. It wasn't conscience that was missing. It was the self. Ted Bundy was called charming and kind. Dennis Rader was a church president. A 2020 meta-analysis found 63% of serial offenders were highly integrated, jobs, families, communities, when they offended. The monster hiding in plain sight isn't a metaphor. It's the statistical norm. Morrison's real warning isn't about monsters. It's about mirrors. What happens when we look at someone and see ourselves reflected back, with nothing behind the reflection? If this changed how you see the people around you, not with fear but with clarity, subscribe to CurioMind. Comment below, which part disturbed you most? I read every one. Next week, the FBI agent who invented criminal profiling, a decade facing Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, and Manson, then going home to his family every night. The case that nearly destroyed him, and the line between hunting monsters and becoming one.